Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Um, we have with us Dr. Caroline Peter Thomas, Laura D. You have to tell me off if I get it wrong, Laura. Laura Di Giacomo and Elizabeth Soul. So we're going to have presentations from each of our guests. We're going to be about 10 minutes each, so hopefully we'll get those done in under an hour, as long as they all behave themselves and keep to time. And then we'll have questions after all four presentations. So we'll hold the questions. If there's any problems, there is a live chat facility, so you can ask questions, for the panelists, but also ask questions, technical questions if you've got any issues. We've got Graham managing the kind of back end of things for us. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline. I'm going to take everyone off the stage and leave Caroline to present her work.
Okay, first job, unmute myself. Second job, can anyone see the slides or not? I've got them ready to go, but I can see them, but I don't know if you can see them. Okay. I don't know how to make them switch onto my slides. I've uploaded them into the system. So, oh, wonderful. There they go. Fantastic. Well, so thank you so much to Ian and colleagues for inviting me to take part in this session today. And I'm coming at this question of the school trip, the school run, from a slightly different angle than perhaps you might expect. And yeah, perhaps not the beginning that you were expecting. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Excellent. So the starting point for this talk today is a piece of work that we did last year for the Scottish Government through Climate Exchange. And that project looked at policy around sustainable travel behaviour for children, young people and their families. And we looked explicitly at everything apart from the school run. And I won't go into the details of what we found, but it was very revealing that actually a lot of our policy says things about school travel, but not about other travel. If you're interested in the findings, the link's there, or you can Google it and read it later. So that work made me think a bit more about policy and what's in policy, and going back to the policy documents that we reviewed. Can I get my next slide, please? Or there we go. So I've gone back to the policies of the 32 Scottish authorities to look at them in a bit more detail, or to go back to them and look at what the policy is saying about travel for children and young people. So I've looked in particular at the local transport strategies and any active travel plans in those local authorities. Not all of the local authorities do have separate transport strategies, so it's not full coverage. And I haven't admittedly got through all 32 yet. It's a work in progress. So I've been searching within those documents to see what they say. I use keywords, children, young people, preschool, high school, primary school, those sorts of things, to see what comes back. And I'm just going to share with you the things that I've been finding. So my next slide, please. So looking across those documents, I can say that in all of the documents I have reviewed, there are more mentions of schools than there are of children. And I would just like to suggest that that is an interesting thing to observe, that we talk more in policy about schools than we do about children themselves. all policy documents also cover and include bike training, so road safety training. Bikeability is the name of the Scottish bike training for children at primary school. So all of the documents that I reviewed included bike training as one of the key policy goals and targets. So increasing the proportion of schools that offer bikeability training, increasing the proportion of children who have done bikeability training by the time they leave primary school. So another common policy goal is about increasing the number of children cycling and walking to school. And in many cases, those policies focus specifically on primary school age children. This may be linked to the data that's available in the Hands Up survey that's done in primary schools that covers travel to school. So this is one of those kind of chicken and egg situations about, do we set a target because the data's there, or are we collecting data because the target's there, or is there a broader question about which children are we expecting to walk and cycle to school, or trying to increase the number of those children walking and cycling to school? And in lots of places, the focus is on primary school age children, and there are no separate targets for high schoolers or preschoolers even. Okay, I'm whizzing through this. Next slide, please. So those are observations for all documents, so something that is common throughout all of the documents I reviewed. It's also true that a good proportion of the documents that I reviewed talk about school travel plans and the idea that primary schools and secondary schools should have school travel plans, and to use that as a way of managing travel behaviour in and to and from school. Many local authorities also talk about school streets, so interventions around the school to encourage cycling and walking, so to reduce traffic around the school and to enable children to be safe, particularly in that last section of their journey. So changes to parking and those sorts of provisions. So most documents mention that, not all. And then some documents, so a subset of the documents, are talking about safe routes to school. They're talking about interventions and projects like iBike. Some of you might know that. That's an intervention around high school, looking at the drop-off in cycling behaviour between primary and secondary age, and particularly with girls. The drop-off of physical activity generally in girls, but so cycling as part of that. So encouraging and supporting high school children to continue to cycle as they move schools. We also get the idea of cycle-friendly schools and supporting local authority schools to be part of that scheme and to gain cycle-friendly status. And then a few authorities have mention of specific projects to promote cycling and promoting cycling to particular groups of children. So there's Play on Pedals, which is a preschool intervention, so providing young children with the opportunity to learn how to ride bike before they start primary school, and in many cases to give them access to a bike or some kind of trike or a wheel device, scooter and things. And there are some other examples of mountain bike projects, for example, targeting high school children. So yes, there are some interesting additional things apart from those common strands about school travel plans and school streets, particular interventions around particular groups of children. So Play on Pedals for preschoolers, iBike for high schoolers, and some other local interventions as well in particular authorities. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm trying to click it and then every time remembering that I don't have control. Okay, so at the other end, so these are just a smaller proportion of local transport strategies are saying this. So a smaller proportion of strategies actually differentiate between children of different ages and talk about interventions for different groups of people. In other cases, they just talk about children generally. And of course, those young chaps on that slide, they have very different needs to my teenagers, very different capabilities. So, so few documents mention those particular groups of children, and Glasgow City Council is an exception to that. So their local transport strategy does talk about those different groups and has interventions around those different groups. Very few documents mention non-school travel. And I want to make this kind of a talking point or something to think about why we don't talk about non-school travel in policy documents, and why we see children only as learners, as children, as being educated, and not as people that go and do other things in the world, that go and play, that go and go to museums or libraries, or go to hospital and go to leisure centres and do sports. So most documents just talk about school travel. They don't talk about other forms of travel just for children. It's starting to creep in recently that have started to talk about everyday journeys for children. A few authorities are starting to talk about access to bikes. So play on pedals I've mentioned, and there's been some schemes in Scotland, and the fact the Green ministers in Scotland have made the addition of the access to bikes for young people part of their offer. So children that don't have a bike, free bikes are provided. And that, again, Glasgow City Council is a wonderful example of talking about access to bikes, having loan libraries, having places where you can have a subscription so you can get a bigger bike as your children grow. And also, very few documents are talking about family cycling or the needs of different kind of combinations of people, the idea that children cycle with others, so cargo bikes and that sort of thing. So making infrastructure that fits with that. All right. So this is a really short kind of review of policy, but digging into the language that we use, the policies that are there, and what it tells us about our expectations about children and what they do and where they go. And I think one of the big challenges is about this. My next slide, please. One of the big challenges is the fact that we tend to see children just in relation to school travel, and we don't talk about wider travel behaviours. Could you just go back a slide? We've got two slides that look very similar, but they've got slightly different content. Thanks. So in the review and in the project we did last year, Aberdeen City became a really interesting example because they have, from their Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan in 2017, this really interesting overarching objective, which was about developing cycle infrastructure across the city. So low speed, low flow streets, segregated cycle lanes that would enable an unaccompanied 12-year-old to cycle through the city centre. So it's very different to those targets and objectives, which are just about enabling more children to cycle to school. This is a wider goal about the city centre, but very specifically about enabling independent mobility, not to go to school, but to do other things, to access the city centre in an independent way. And if we move on to the next slide, please, we can see a new iteration of that goal, which is to enable all young people to travel to school by active travel or sustainable modes, and providing skills and infrastructure to allow them to undertake journeys safely and independently. So although we've got school travel in there, we also have in the second part that broader goal about enabling young people to travel independently and safely and providing infrastructure to do that. So not just providing road safety training at primary school and having school streets around the school that allows children to make those types of journeys, but actually those broader other journeys, the everyday journeys. So my last slide, please. So just to conclude, and as I say, this is a work in progress, so I may well add some more nuance to this analysis in due course, but this is an evolving policy area around children and young people and mobility. We're seeing, or I'm seeing in the Scottish policy, some dividing of the language and the focus, so away simply from school travel to other types of everyday journeys, away from just training to also infrastructure, access to bikes as well, training not just for primary school children, but for older children and returners and adults too. But at the end of the day, school travel is still a universal policy goal and a universal target in Scottish policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay with kind of us moving people around, so apologies to the audience for the slight gaps in our presentations. That's really interesting. I mean, it gives us a slightly different view of this topic. So I think we'll, as I said, we'll move through the presentations. We'll have all four. But thank you, Caroline. I should have introduced you formally, shouldn't I, as assistant professor at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. In the Urban Studies unit, is that correct?
The Urban Institute.
Urban Institute. Okay, Thank you. Okay, thank you, Caroline. So next we have Laura Di Giacomo, who is an environmental sustainability consultant, and we've met Laura at a conference in Oxford where she was presenting around work she'd done with a primary school on School Street. So I'm going to bring Laura to the stage now and her presentation. And hopefully Laura will be able to take you through what we found very interesting.
Okay. Okay. Good morning. Yes, my name is Laura Di Giacomo, and today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of support measures in school street schemes. And I'm showing the case of St. Ebbe's Primary School in Oxford. St. Ebbe's is the school where my kids go, and I have to say I am also a convinced cyclist. I also work as active travel champion in the school when the school street scheme was launched. Next slide, please. Thank you. No, the previous one, please. Yes, thank you. St. Ebbe's School is located in Northrow Road in the center of Oxford. Next slide, please. I don't know how to move it. Yes, thank you. It welcomes around 180 families from a vast area, and 52 of which live more than 1 kilometer from the school. Next one, please. The traffic situation at drop-off and pick-up time was horrible. The school is very narrow. There are cars parked on both sides, and unfortunately, a lot of parents decided to drive the children to school. Air quality, safety, it was just appalling. So it was a very needed and wanted scheme, as we can see. Next slide, please. In the survey that was run across the parents, so around 63 of the families were in favor of a school street scheme, and only 16% of the responses were against a school street scheme. Next. Thank you. So we've gotten even some quotes for parents saying the pollution outside St. Ebbe's is appalling, but the main issue is safety. I myself have been nearly knocked off my bike close to St. Ebbe's by a driver. And another parent said, we would like our older children to go to school on their own, but the current traffic situation in White House Road does not allow this. So when the school street scheme was launched in 2021, for the first 6 weeks of trial, there were strict pass criteria for the family who wanted an exemption pass. There was a rota of really motivated volunteers managing the barrier, and a support measure called the Park and Stride was set up. And basically, parents could park for free at a car park that is within the 5-minute walking bubble. The road was really transformed. Everybody seems to be happy, and it was just wonderful. Next slide, please. So after the first 6 weeks trial, the second trial started, but unfortunately the situation changed dramatically, and the school started facing some unexpected challenges. So what was happening? In reality, so actually the parents during the first 6 weeks didn't really engage with the mod chief. Basically they just were holding on, waiting for the trial to finish and just go back to the previous habits. So let me quote Elizabeth Fisher in the book Environmental Law. Basically, people, including me in this case, parents, never thought it was due to their own car. So the only support measure in place, the Park and Stride, was not working, and the situation became very soon confrontational between parents and school, and the school find itself in a conflict of interest because it was acting as a gatekeeper. Next one, please. So the consequences were that there was a constant flow of parents asking the school for exemption. The school had to loosen the initial very strict criteria and allowed more than 50 cars through the barrier. For this reason, the volunteers started to get really frustrated because of the number of cars going through every day, and they didn't find the school street scheme being very effective, and therefore the school street scheme was on the verge of collapse. This is This is when the school decided to appoint an active travel champion, me, using a grant provided by the city council. In my role, I had to address the parents that were finding difficulties with the school street scheme and help them to find alternative solutions to driving the kids to school. What I propose is to set up and create a portfolio of hands-on support. So, next slide, please. So the question is, why this confrontation situation happened? What wasn't working? So in reality, the Park and Stride was a good idea, but the work takes too long when you have small children with you, and that wasn't really a viable solution for working parents. And as a parent in school, it was pretty clear. It was clear to me that there was a considerable amount of parents that were living at the cycling distance, but they didn't know how to cycle. They had never learned to cycle, or they were too unconfident to do so. So in the first months of in my position, I set up a bike library, absolute beginner course for children and parents, a bike bus, a walking bus, and free breakfast club was offered. All these support measures were set up in collaboration with the community in the school, myself, my family, and the school itself. Meanwhile, more than 20 parents contacted me for a pass, and just explaining them the reason why the school street scheme was important for all the children, and offering them the first support measure that I had already put in place 2/3 of them just withdrew their request. The outcomes of the support measure were through the 4 absolute beginner cycling courses that were run using the bikes from the bike library. We were able to train up to 24 between kids and parents, either to learn to cycle or to get back to their bikes. 8 families can now cycle to school. 6 families are currently using bikes and a bike trailer from the bike library. And up to 8 children were using the walking bus. So in January 2023, it was announced the ANPR cameras were coming into operation after 18 months of trialing the scheme. Thanks to volunteers. We still had 60 cars on the white list, with 20 of them regularly going through the barrier every day. So we started working more closely with the Oxford County Council. We asked them to act as a third party and helping defining strict exemption criteria to revisit all the passes on the white list and to be responsible for issuing passes. So I personally communicate with every single driver that was going through the barrier every morning, explaining them all the support measures that were in place. And when the camera went live, there was no confrontational situation at all. So let me conclude now. I found the process incredibly fascinating. So on one side, it wasn't really true the parents weren't willing to change. They were willing, they just needed help, they just needed support, they just needed an additional help to knock down the barrier that stopped them to engage with the mode shift. And on the other hand, being able to go and talk to the parent with a range of really practical alternatives turn a very confrontational situation into a positive and an accepted scheme. So now I thank you, and I leave you with a nice picture of the bike shed of the school.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's fascinating seeing Laura, because we've heard her talk before about what is actually needed to, develop a school street, the amount of work that goes into it. So yeah, thank you for that. So we're going to move on to Liz. So I'm going to run Liz's presentation for her. If you're all ready to go, Liz, I'll move them on as you need.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ian. So yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. My name is Elizabeth, although everyone does call me Liz, and I'm from Transport for Greater Manchester's active travel team. So I'll move on to the next slide, and before I get into my presentation, I'll just tell you a little bit about my organisation and my team, in case you've not heard of us. So TFGM, we're all about keeping Greater Manchester moving, helping people get from A to B. And we're doing this by rolling out the B network. So this is the ambition for a world-class joined up transport network, which is all under local control. The team that I work in is the active travel team, which is the happy bunch of people on the screen that you can see there. So we work across Greater Manchester to help communities make more journeys by walking or wheeling. And part of my role is working within the education sector, which is why I've been asked to present today. So if we move on to the next slide, I will give you a quick overview of my presentation. So I'm going to look at the sort of Greater Manchester context of the school run, understand potential demand and opportunity to enable active travel to school, talk about the help that schools and young people might need and what is out there to help them do more, and touch on what TFGM is also doing as well to enable active travel to school. So if we move on to looking at why are we enabling people to walk and wheel on the school run? I mean, I think that a number of you on the call may already know this, but I just think it's important to remind us of why we are doing what we're doing. So not only is walking and wheeling often the most reliable way to travel, it's much more fun for both adults and kids, and it allows us to spend more quality time together. You know, doing the school run allows children to talk to us when we're making our way back about how the day's been, and we can give them our full attention. We also know that improving physical activity is great for our mood, our stress, our anxiety, and it starts to normalize building exercise into our daily routine. We know that there's also a positive relationship between physical activity and academic performance, and that streets around the school are often less congested. Makes it way more attractive for us to walk around and move in those spaces and spend more time in those spaces. It's also good for the environment, improving air quality, and also children who are walking and wheeling to school from an early age actually have more road sense and improved ability to travel independently safely as they get older. So it's all about empowering and enabling our young people as well. So that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. If we sort of move on to the next slide, we can look at what is the story in Greater Manchester. Nationally, we know that 1 in 5 cars that are on the road during peak morning times are involved in the school run. Within Greater Manchester, we know that almost a third of all journeys less than 1 kilometre are made by car, and 75% of our primary school children are travelling less than 2 kilometres to school. We also have a significant number of young people who are classed as inactive within Greater Manchester, and we've got over a third of our primary schools affected by poor air quality. So I know that might sound pretty gloomy for a gloomy Thursday, but we do know that walking and wheeling to school can help to address some of these issues. But I guess it's really important for me and my team to sort of understand, is that what people want as well? Is there demand for this? So we know it's really important, but do people want that as well? So if we move on to the next slide, got some sort of evidence here to say from the Walking and Cycling Index, which found that there was support from parents and carers of more sort of low traffic neighbourhoods, which I know we are maybe not allowed to say anymore, more school streets, and just a general desire for more active travel, people wanting to go in by walking or wheeling rather than going by car. And it was quite interesting that 73% of parents said that they wanted their children to travel actively, although only 54% currently did. So we think that there definitely is parent and carer demand. And I think it's really important to see what do young people want as well. So if we move on to the next slide, we're sort of looking at the demand that young people might have, and unsurprisingly, they are even more keen than their parents and carers. So 48% of children want to cycle to school, even though only about 2% currently do. I've also got some quotes on the slide here, which have been taken from young people at schools in Greater Manchester who've had school street trials. So as the previous presenter said, this is closing off the road at pick up and drop off time, just to create a safer space for children to move around in on the last leg of their journey to school. So there's real support from the young people whenever we're doing these kind of initiatives and activities. And on the right as well is a poster that a young person did to encourage their parents and carers help keep the roads safe. So young people really do want safer spaces outside their school, and they do really want to be travelling to school in more active ways as well. So looking at this, we know we've got demand from parents and the young people. The important thing now is to look at whether there is actually opportunity. So if we move on to the next slide, we've taken some statistics here from the Walking and Cycling Index again, which do demonstrate that we do have opportunity in Greater Manchester to enable more active travel on the school run. So 84% of households who live within 800 metres of a primary school. Obviously caveated, there is a possibility that that might not be their primary school. But if you remember at the start when I spoke about the GM context, 75% of primary school children do live less than 2 kilometres, which would indicate that there is opportunity. Over 2/3 of households have got at least one child bike as well. So again, often bikes are bought when children are little, but then the behaviour doesn't carry on for lots of different reasons. So there's lots of opportunity in terms of where people are located and their access to bikes. But also we've got a massive amount of capital investment in Greater Manchester to connect up communities across the whole of the conurbation with walking and cycling routes. And the idea is that these need to be competent for a 12-year-old on a bicycle or a parent or carer pushing a double buggy. And within this capital, we've had over 50 kilometres of network completed to date. We've got further funding for delivery for another 50 kilometres, and then there's a further 80 kilometres in the pipeline ready and waiting for funding. So if we reflect on this, we've got the demand and we've got the opportunity. So how are we doing it? How are we going to make more people walk or wheel more? I mean, there's loads of ways that I would say that schools and communities can be enabled to walk and wheel more. The first thing that I would always recommend is that they do research. So talking with stakeholders like parents, carers, residents, those who operate in the local community groups such as Walk Ride, local councillors, etc. And that's really to understand the barriers and the opportunities in the area. And also to speak to other schools and other community groups to understand what has been done and learn from them. So let's sort of work on our effectiveness here and sort of get best practice and reiterate that. There's also loads of activities that can be done to assist with behaviour change, such as demonstrating a commitment to a school travel plan, keeping that up to date, perhaps introducing park and stride locations for those that we know can't walk or wheel the whole way, developing a safe parking charter, again, for those who are using the car for their journey. And this would also be for staff to sign up for, as well as parents and carers. We've got lots of confidence builders that can help, such as taking part in bikeability training, which is organised by the local authority, setting up walking buses, setting up cycling buses, loads of national campaigns such as Sustrans Big Walk and Wheel, Living Streets Walk to School Week, Living Streets Walk to School Month. There's Clean Air Day, which is often in the summer as well. So there's lots of activity that schools can tie into here. And whenever doing these activities, I would always suggest some type of gamification to engage pupils and families, offering sort of competitions and rewards that suit the ethos of the school. So whether that's house points, raffles, prizes, reward letters and thank yous from the head, whatever suits the school. For those kind of physical restraints, school streets, they've been mentioned, and also providing storage for scooters, cycles and wellies so that when the young people are getting to school, they've got somewhere to put the equipment that they've used in order to make that journey. Again, there's so much more that can be done as well, setting up eco councils, getting accredited through Motive Stars. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to my last slide, or penultimate slide, to show what TFGM is doing to enable active travel on the school run. So we've got quite a lot of projects and programmes, some of which are on this slide. I'm not going to go through each one in detail, but if you do want information on this or want to have a chat about it, or if it's got any questions raised, please get in touch either directly from my email or via the email that's on the last slide of this PowerPoint. I'm really happy to have a conversation about anything if you feel that your school community or your family could benefit from these. So we've got toolkits to help school staff and students undertake activity independently. We can create a bespoke map for any school in Greater Manchester, which on one side provides advice on sustainable travel, and on the other side shows walking and cycling routes, park and stride routes, the best locations to get into school. We've also funded Motive Stars for all of the schools in Greater Manchester to access. This enables schools to become accredited and rewarded for their sort of sustainable travel activity, with a bit of light touch support from TFGM and the local authorities. We've partnershipped with Living Streets, who work with a number of primary schools delivering their WOW programme. We also have a slightly more hands-on project called Own the Ride, which offers cycle confidence training to secondary school pupils who are in Year 7 and Year 8, either for those that have missed out on bikeability or perhaps those who need additional confidence to go on the road. We funded a number of school streets pilots that our local authorities are delivering, and we are committed to doing 13 more by March 24, and we've done 24 to date already. We also have more intensive support, such as our Youth Travel Ambassador programme, where we've got an officer whose sole job it is to go into secondary schools and work with the young people to help them be empowered to research, plan, and then deliver an active travel campaign that is unique to their school. But within Transport for Greater Manchester, the work is not exclusive to our team. So we have a partnerships and engagement team who work closely with the Greater Manchester Combined Youth Network and the heads of education across all of the boroughs. We have our Travel Safe team who proactively and reactively engage with schools to help young people travel safely. And our strategy team are currently working with the 10 local authorities to develop a Greater Manchester-wide active travel strategy that will set out our vision for encouraging more people to travel sustainably and the steps that we'll take to achieve this. So I know that's a lot of information. I'm really happy to have a chat about it. But I think ultimately we sort of know how important it is to work closely with schools, parents and young people to enable active travel to school. And by working together, we can hopefully help more young people have the freedom to travel in a healthier and safer, more effective way. You know, we've got lots of opportunity here and lots of demand to enable more families and young people to travel by active modes. There are loads of initiatives to support it. And one thing that I would really encourage is that anyone who's working with schools or communities is to really engage with the young people and ask them what it is that they want. How do they want to travel? What would support them? Because doing things to children is really disempowering. So involving them and making them part of the decisions that we make is really key. So thank you very much for your time. And I guess we're doing all of the presentations in one go and then asking questions at the end, which I'll be happy to answer.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, Liz. I should have introduced you properly, shouldn't I? Senior Active Travel Officer at Transport for Greater Manchester. But yeah, really interesting to hear, you know, the perspective of the TFGM, you know, so we're getting a range of perspectives on this topic. But thank you. Yeah, we'll do questions at the end, but thank you very much, Liz. So I'm just going to bring Asa in. Before I do, if anyone has any questions, in YouTube on the right-hand side, there's a chat function. So make sure you ask any questions and we'll attempt to answer those as a group once we've had Asa's presentation.
Hello.
So, hi, Asa. So I should introduce you properly. You are a PhD researcher at the University of Westminster.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Can you see my slides, or are they?
I can't yet. I think I need to add them from you. Just bear with me.
Okay. Yeah, I've got them. I can sort of. Okay, there we go. Yeah,
That's
correct. Yeah, I'm also now.
I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, yeah, I'm a PhD researcher at the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster, and I've also just started as a research fellow at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of West of England. But I'm going to be talking about my PhD research here, which has focused on school streets, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about their impact on travel behavior. So it's going to be a slightly, yeah, maybe kind of connections and some slightly different perspectives to what we've heard so far. So when I started the PhD, this was kind of the question that was set to me. Can small-scale changes to streets and how they're accessed lead to changes in travel behavior? And this was not necessarily to do with school streets in particular. It could have been any such kind of intervention, but at the time, school streets were becoming more prevalent in the UK, and especially in London, where I was focusing the research. And there wasn't much research on them, so I thought that might be a kind of a nice way into kind of looking at that question. And so I started my research just to the left of this yellow line here, and so this is in January 2020. And when I started it, there were not very many school streets. There's about 50 in London, well, just still quite a few. But in comparison to kind of what happened sort of immediately after I began, there weren't very many. So now, sort of very quickly in September 2020, that month, there were over 200 school streets installed in London. and the kind of rate has still continued to trickle along since then, and there's nearly 600 in operation at the moment in the city, which is nearly a third of all state-run primary schools. So this kind of explosion in school streets in London really changed how I was able to do the research. I mean, it was also limited by the fact that we were in lockdowns, and so you might notice that the perspective of my research is perhaps a little bit less, a bit more abstracted than some of the other discussions we've been having about kind of what happens within schools in particular. But this kind of abstracted, being able to look at things from the city scale was also allowed because there were all of a sudden so many schemes in the city. And so I kind of developed a sort of ad hoc research approach as things went along. In the middle of lockdown, I was able to kind of interview 18 practitioners and policymakers about how they'd kind of done this big. So if we go, how this big spike had happened, how it had they'd facilitated so many schemes going in London in such a short period of time, but also talking about the mechanisms of behavioral change that a school street might integrate with. So getting back to that sort of central research question that I was focusing on. And then I also did a bit of research just on where all the school streets were in the city. And thanks to the charity Mums for Lungs and some colleagues at Sustrans, we were able to kind of develop a database of all the school street schemes in London, which is much more complicated than it actually sounds, but very helpful because it allowed for kind of an analysis of the spatial distribution of the schemes in the city on terms of kind of their equity in terms of various social and environmental indicators. And I'm not going to be talking so much about that today, but that's a paper that's available if you're interested in. And then this also means that I was able to kind of look at the Transport for London's STARS hands up travel survey data and get a sense of the behavioral impact of these schemes on the city scale, which is something that I'm going to focus in slightly more on now. This flowchart is just a very complicated way of saying something that is really simple, which is that for a lot of the benefits that a school street might provide, a lot of them are actually realized by having some kind of element of modal shift, people getting out of their cars for a certain proportion or ideally all of the trip. And that extends the benefits out from just the immediate closure area where cars are removed, but also to the general neighborhood. And it also, for certain benefits that are often talked about around physical activity, that kind of modal shift needs to be kind of there for that to be really part of what is happening with the school street scheme. So there is, considering some of these benefits, so if we're thinking about air quality, road safety, physical activity, and modal shift, there is some evidence. And after I started researching this, a lot of kind of very interesting bits of research came out, usually commissioned by local authorities, transport authorities, and such like. So for air quality, there was a really great report commissioned by the GLA, which saw a 23% reduction in NO2 concentrations at the school streets versus comparator groups, which is a great piece of evidence. Another really, really great report from Sustrans on looking at the displacement of traffic around school street schemes, and also the sort of observing the sort of safety implications of what was going on at those closures, and then some stuff on sociality and the pedestrian experience over there. And then, but modal shift, the evidence has been a little bit weaker so far. This is a report I was involved in very early on in 2021, where we kind of meta-analyzed a lot of the existing kind of monitoring and evaluation work that had been done by local authorities before COVID, and we estimated a sort of 3 to 6% decrease in motor vehicle use associated with the school street from those. But that was a bit of a guess in some ways. There was no control groups. It was based on maybe a handful, maybe 20 schools. And so I thought that there's still really a big kind of research gap on this. So I was able to do some research on this, as I mentioned earlier, using the Transport for London STARS data. And this is a bit of a patchy data set, unfortunately, unlike Scotland. Our Hands Up survey data in the UK, or sorry, in England, is much rougher. It's a bit better in London, lots of schools are involved in the STARS scheme in some way. And of the primary schools in London, 500 or so had really had solid surveys, so with a good response rate, and with several before COVID and several kind of in 2021 and 2022. And this allowed for, and about 100 of those schools had school streets. So I was able to do a kind of before and after and intervention and control analysis. And I was actually a little bit surprised to see that there was actually a decent effect of a sort of, roughly 4% reduction in car use and 4% increase in active travel associated with the schools that had school streets. We can see here that, not to get too technical, but the error bars on these ones after the school street are a little bit wide, so there's a lot of different outcomes, but it is a statistically significant effect. So that's kind of interesting, and I think sort of getting back to that question of, does a small change in access to a street lead to a behavioral change? I think it's interesting that that is something that was observed, because I think there's also a question as to, whether that's enough of an intervention to sort of do that. But this kind of doesn't really tell us much more about what's going on at these schools or what's actually happening. And it's a bit of a limitation of the research, but I asked a lot of the people that I was interviewing what they thought about what was going on at the schools, what was leading to behavioral change at schools that had school streets. And there's I got a lot of different responses and a big range of responses, which was a bit of a difficult thing from a research perspective, because I was hoping to be able to kind of latch onto something and test it in my data, but there was a lot of different things that were coming up. So a big one that came up was convenience or inconvenience. So a school street makes driving less convenient, and for shorter trips, that means that people decide to switch mode. The other one is that active modes are attracted to the space by kind of making it more present. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin in some ways. And the others are, I guess, a lot of other things around that are going on in the school. So these are maybe some of the supporting interventions that we've already heard about. So how involved is the school leadership? How involved is the parental body? What was the kind of engagement that went into it? Was there any, which was a difficult thing in COVID, because there wasn't necessarily a lot of that going on, at least in some of the London schools where things were happening really quickly. And there was no sort of formal model of behavior change that was kind of being used to design, or at least understand how school streets were operating, which makes sense a little bit, I think. It's not necessarily seen as a behavior change measure in the way that, say, something that like lessons around learning to cycle might be, but nonetheless it has that goal of behavior change in it. And so there's been some interesting research that I think kind of gives some context to this. So other schemes that seek to kind of make walking more pleasant while also making driving less convenient have some success in terms of modal shift, and we've seen this with some of the emerging research on low traffic neighborhoods, if we're allowed to say that. And I think there's been some interesting sort of systematic reviews looking at the efficacy of carrots, sticks, and I'm sort of calling carrot sticks. And so that's incentives, sort of disincentives, and measures that mix both of them together. And often this is done on like a sort of city scale, talking about, improving public transport and introducing a congestion charge. But some have looked at it even on the level of improving the quality of the street and removing convenience for motor vehicles. And these seem to be some indications that this is an effective approach to pursuing mobility transitions. So it's possible that there's some kind of interplay between the two at school streets, in that they are both improving the public space and making it more inconvenient to drive. And if that is the case, then there are some interesting questions for designers that kind of come out of that. We need to kind of be balancing inconvenience and improvement of the space. And one thing that comes up a lot is how many exemptions do you provide? How much residual traffic is there? The larger schemes are, the more inconvenient it might be for drivers, but then also the more residual traffic that you might have, and that might compromise the quality of the space to some extent. But it also hints that if improving the kind of quality of the space is an important element, there's also scope for improving the public realm in some ways, and moving beyond, I guess, just thinking about it as a road closure, but also as a road transformation. And there are some schemes in London that are doing that. In fact, the one that's just around the corner from my house has just turned into a full closure and a full pedestrianization with planting. And I think it's a really wonderful new kind of public space. And it's interesting to see that this kind of transformation, there's a potential that that might also be part of this kind of change in behavior. So yeah, here's lots of, I mean, it's a bit squished, but there's lots of references here if anyone wants to follow up any of that research that I talked about. And yeah, thank you very much. That's me.
Thank you, Asa. Yeah, again, a slightly different perspective coming from an academic. So I'm just going to bring all the other panelists back on. If you could just all unmute yourselves. Graham's going to feed me some questions from the audience. I think, just from my own observation, well, thank you for keeping to time, firstly. A very well-behaved panelists for early in the morning. Is that there seems to be, at least we seem to be aligned in terms of policy, you know, the stuff Liz is talking about and the stuff that schools are trying to do, and kind of, you know, the academic research, it all seems to be aligned that people do want this. You know, we are trying to do the things that people want us to do. So it doesn't seem to be that there's a lot of objections. It just seems to be it's finding the right solution. Would you say that's accurate? Anyone feel free to jump in on any of these questions, by the way. We're not going to direct them at anyone particularly. Or if you don't answer, I will make you.
I'll answer.
Oh.
Go, Elizabeth.
Well, I think that for anyone that has worked within schools, each school is really unique, and the culture of the school is really unique. And what makes anything a success, whether we're talking about a school street or encouraging children to walk or cycle, really is that leadership. So often we've got lots of solutions, we've got lots of things in our toolkit, we've got lots of pointy carrots, or, you know, just carrots or just sticks. And it really is finding a solution, because there is not one size fits all with this kind of approach. And that's the same for school streets. It's the same for getting various types of accreditations. And it's very difficult sometimes to find that approach, because it is so bespoke and so unique, really. And schools also have a lot of fatigue, because there is a lot of things out there and they have different priorities to what we have. And it's just about working together and collaborating and finding what suits that school and that community best, really, which is time consuming, but once it's right, it tends to work quite well with strong leadership. Yeah, like you say, that kind of individuality for each school, it seems to be quite important. Did you want to add to that, Laura?
I completely agree. I think what was underestimated at the beginning is sometimes it was exactly just the support measure was too simplified, and it didn't really it wasn't really taking account of the real need of these parents. And I was working 1 day a week for the school. It wasn't really a full-time job. It was just being able to listen, to understand, and to create what the parents actually needed. And then that completely changed everything. So yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
Do you want to? Are we going to ask take a question from the audience? Unless Asa and Caroline have got anything to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say something that I think this idea that there's a culture and also that there's multiple things that are needed is I think what's coming through in my policy analysis is that you know, in the past we've very much focused on certain particular types of intervention, and now we're seeing a diversification of that. So acknowledgement in policy, like policy in Glasgow, that the importance, it's not just about having the walk to school week or those sorts of things, but it's having multiple things. So school streets, school travel plans, and access to bikes and access to training, and some of the iBike stuff, which is about culture, not just about but also then infrastructure. So all of these things have to work together, and I think that comes through all of the presentations today, that there's no magic bullet, no silver bullet to solve all of this in one go. It has to be a complex mosaic of interventions that are tailored to the particular place and particular time.
Yeah, I think that feeds into what you were saying, Asa, wasn't it, about the kind of public realm improvements as part of that?
Yeah, I think it's something that is perhaps overlooked sometimes. I mean, it's expensive, and I think that's perhaps why. But I think in interesting, I think to some extent, there's been a bit of a focus on school streets as the kind of way to approach the area outside of the school, and that is a sort of temporary and recurring closure. But there might actually be lots of other opportunities, and I think also the focus on travel behavior or certain kind of goals, but also just having an additional space for children and parents to kind of be in and perhaps socialize and interact has a lot of other balance, and perhaps also helps to build some of that kind of culture of different activities being recognized as within the street, or and that's only something that can be enabled more so through the public realm. So I think, thinking about the kind of numerous different ways that these things feed in is helpful.
Yeah, we've got a question from Alan, which I kind of really kind of relates to that, and I think this might be one for you, Caroline, because you were talking about this. That so Alan's asking, is children cycling for play on local streets still a gap, although that could have lots of educational and social value? Even the developing broad view seems to consider only utility cycling. Yeah, so like, as you were saying, Caroline, we talk about travel to school, but for children, but we don't talk about that independent mobility more generally.
Yeah, great question. And so there's definitely an overlap. And in the project that I talked about at the beginning, the one that we did for Climate Exchange last year, we looked at play, and we looked at the intersection between play policy and travel and sustainable travel. So we looked at that intersection, and there is definitely potential there, but there's very little in Scottish policy that draws those things together, apart from the playing out type of street closure or play streets. So you have these temporary street closures that allows a residential street usually to be a space then for families and residents to use it and take away the car dominance, so children can play out. But I think Welsh policy comes in here, and I'd love to big up the Welsh policy folks who are doing some great work. So in Wales, they have this place efficiency duty, which that's been in place for more than 10 years now. And that requires local authorities to assess play opportunities in their area, to match the play opportunities with the children in their area, and then produce action plans for improving play opportunities. That includes sort of supported play and play workers, as well as physical play spaces. But the really interesting thing is that in the Welsh policy approach, they see the street as a place for play. And so that place efficiency duty encompasses the neighbourhood, encompasses the places that children live, not just the play parks and not just school, but the street around their home. And it says very clearly that we should make those places safe for children to play, so they can ride their bikes and do everyday activities in the neighbourhood, and they can be safe as a pedestrian, as a cyclist in their neighbourhood. Scottish policy hasn't done that, and it's kept play as a separate thing linked to green space. This is new policy in Scotland. It's just coming into effect this year in 23. So it'd be interesting to see how this boils, but you know, what this comes down to at the end, how it kind of shakes out in time. But it's very different to the Welsh approach, and I think that there's a big gap. There is a gap, potential gap here about seeing street play and it being inclusive of cycling and wheeling is the other, you know, term. So yeah, using your scooters and those sorts of things. So yeah, loads of potential there, I think.
Do you want to add anything to that, Liz? Because you know we have had some play streets in Greater Manchester, but we haven't had a lot, have we?
No, there's various sort of toolkits out there on the Playing Out website. TFGM have got one, and local authorities, I think there was a commitment to allowing some temporary closures that weren't ongoing and permanent, i.e. not school streets, but just one-off community streets that they would be requested, and there wasn't the charge, because otherwise there is a highways charge for putting in a temporary or an experimental traffic order. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting point. When we've been doing some feedback about some of our school street schemes at the moment, someone commented that the road being closed at pick up and drop off time meant that kids now thought that they could play in the street. And this was clearly said in a very negative way, which was just incredibly sad that children just aren't allowed to play anymore. But then if they sit inside on their Xbox, well, they're not getting outside playing, are they? And there's a real kind of tension, I think, sometimes, which is why I think ultimately, if we ask young people what they want and work with them, then we're kind of saying if they want that play space, then we can use them and their voice rather than being grown-ups that are making decisions on behalf of young people. But yeah, there's a toolkit online for anyone in Greater Manchester that wants to do community streets, it's called, on the TFGM website. And it's got a list of printouts and how to do it, who to contact in your local authority, how to do research, how to contact people. So there's lots of information out there if people do want to do this as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So we have got a question from for Laura. So for just hide that. So yeah, so Jill was asking if you had enough volunteers. I know you did a lot of the work yourself, Laura.
So yes,
I mean, does it ultimately have to include ANPR?
Interesting question. We did. Okay, I think we're back. Sorry. We did have enough volunteers, but also they were really motivated to, I mean, consider that they endured for 18 months and the camera actually should have come much sooner than 18 months. So the answer is yes. What is sustainable? It's hard to say. So in an ideal world, in my opinion, you should be able to have an enforced school street scheme without volunteers, without a barrier, without a camera. Okay, because honestly, I never met a parent who didn't agree about air quality is important for their children, road safety is important for their children, and the children love to walk and cycle to school. So these are things where people really generally agree. But but honestly, it would have been possible without volunteers, without a bar, and without a stick. So it's complicated. I think with the right communication, with the right work on parents and preparation, and you can really limit it, the time and and the amount maybe also of volunteers, because the other thing is, because the situation was very confrontational at the beginning, being the parent wasn't a nice experience. So a lot of volunteers just dropped after a while. And we need more volunteers, but actually So you just need one volunteer if this is like a pleasant job. You know what?
Yeah.
You understand what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
very complicated, and I think my advice would be trying to have trying to avoid the confrontational situation as much as possible, trying to have a dialogue, a communication with the parents, because this is something that actually it benefits the whole community.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And even now that we've got the cameras on, sometimes I think we've got cameras and nobody is driving through.
So it's an expense that,
So
yeah.
we could have spent that money in a better way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just come in there? Because
Yeah,
I think
of
this is
course.
a really interesting question about how we make policies work on the ground. And I mentioned Glasgow earlier on when I was talking, and Glasgow has got some interesting policy around bike buses and walking buses, and so encouraging those. But it notes in its active travel strategy that these should be led by parents in order to make them sustainable in the long term. And I think this is a really curious. I was really surprised when I saw it, and I think it raises a really interesting or a really difficult question about how we make things work in the long term. And I think there is a debate and a discussion to be had about designing interventions which require volunteers. And as some people have argued, a bike bus is the symbol of failure, that there is no safe infrastructure, and we require people to shepherd children on bikes or to walk them to school because they can't do that safely themselves. So I just wanted to sort of add to this thing about the volunteering. I really like Laura's point about if it's a good enjoyable job, people will do it. But the reality is many of these things can be really confrontational. And I know from my own children's primary school where a school street was implemented, and there were people threatening to beat up parents and telling them they were vigilantes and all sorts of things. And it makes it really hard to sustain those interventions in those confrontational situations.
Yeah, and I think there was, we saw the Bikey Bus presentation at the conference, didn't we, which is in Barcelona, and there was a real discrepancy between the areas that people could afford to spend their time volunteering to run the Bikey Bus, but in the lower areas with greater poverty, the people just couldn't afford to run them. So there's a real issue there around who can afford to spend the time volunteering to run these schemes, which but like you say, if there's infrastructure, then you wouldn't need that volunteer.
Can I comment on that for a second? I think just on this this idea of kind of volunteers and ANPR, I think it brings up loads of really interesting questions actually, and I think people have touched on them already. But one of them I think as well is I guess the ANPR often is like the sort of technological fix for not being able to kind of maintain volunteer, and that's often I think that's right. And I think it's been really successful in kind of managing that, but I think also you end up kind of losing maybe some of the kind of interpersonal relationships, or the element of creating a space that is also a sort of social space, or one is distinct from the rest of the streets around it, without kind of that kind of human volunteer element, or some sort of kind of barrier being there. And I remember a school street that I was kind of doing some research on in Hackney, where there was a lollipop person who was kind of on a crossing nearby to the school street, but it was also kind of putting a kind of ad hoc barrier in the street when the closure time was, because the ANPR had too many exemptions or people kind of cutting through, and it kind of needed it to kind of reassert that space is like, no, this is actually closed now, and you're going to have to kind of negotiate this barrier. And it made me think a little bit about, and there was some indications. I was doing some kind of very kind of close-knit analysis of what was going on that street, and kind of weirdly during the closure times for the remaining cars that were there, of which there were quite a few exempt. Some of the traffic speeds increased even slightly, which is because it was now just fewer cars on that stretch of street than there was before. And so the kind of weird thing about that ANPR is that obviously it introduces a financial penalty for driving through, but that car is still there when it gets a penalty, and it's still perhaps in a space that maybe is less kind of managed in that way. So it's a really hard one. ANPR has kind of enabled this sort of really like large, huge number of schools that maybe don't have that kind of social infrastructure or the social capital for parents to kind of put all that through. But I wonder if it's, there's a kind of, it has a different kind of implementation in terms of the scheme itself.
Well, it's okay because we won't be using any traffic enforcement anymore anyway, will we?
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is. Yeah, there may need to be a reassessment of the volunteer school street. Going forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, there is another question for you, Asa. That is, in addition to replacing car trips, have you considered replacing trips with public transport to active travel?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. So in that data I was looking at, I couldn't tell, it wasn't individual level, so school level. So I couldn't see what people would be going from or to, just the kind of overall mode share of a school. But that is an interesting element. And I think actually the background trends for this were an increase across kind of all schools, and then was sort of an increase in private motor vehicle use in this time, which is before and after kind of years on either side of 2020, essentially, was what I was looking at. And then there was also obviously a decrease in public transport use, which is still quite marginal. It's only about 7% on average for primary schools in London. So there was that decrease there. And I think there was some sense, I mean, it's hard to know which trips were going where, but with some car use increasing at non-school street schools and public transport decreasing at all schools, it seems that there was a kind of sense that some of those trips were going to active modes, hopefully, then as opposed to car modes, but it's hard to know which way it was going. So I think that is an interesting issue. I mean, I know definitely in secondary school travel, it's kind of, kids in London get free travel. And I remember sort of talking to a local authority, active travel officers, saying it's a really challenge to try and get their secondary school students to consider active travel because they have so much kind of bus availability and affordability, and that being a kind of issue. But I definitely was focusing on private car use as the kind of method in there. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that echoes the research Graham was doing around e-scooters. He found that they didn't necessarily replace car trips, but replaced like Uber journeys and maybe bits of public transport. So I'm just looking over at him because he's sat there. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how we think. There was a presentation again at the conference that if you increase, I think it was public transport options, it probably possibly takes away from active travel. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic between different modes and how people choose, what they can use. Okay, so we have got there's a question from somebody called Graham Sheriff, but I think we'll skip that one. We'll take the one from Chaz. So if somewhere like Kirklees, if you know it, is in I think near Leeds, there's very little dedicated routes, no cycling commissioner, needs a lot more advocacy, lots more social modelling. There's lots to do. Where do you start with that? This is a general question, I think, for everybody. Caroline, you
get yourself a cycling. Get yourself first cycling mare. So I didn't realise this because I thought cycling mares were some kind of formal thing. Well, they are a formal thing, but you can basically put yourself forward to be the cycling mayor for your area. And there is a process you have to go to, and you do have to apply and kind of set out your agenda, but then you become the cycling mayor. And you become part of a network. And we saw this in Dublin. So for those of you who don't know, I met Ian and Graham and folks in Dublin at the Cycling and Society conference in September. And I also met the Dublin Cycle Mayor, and I also happen to know Inverness's cycling mayor. And they have their own WhatsApp group. Who knew? This international group of cycling mayors share their stories and share experiences and share tips. So that in itself might seem quite minor, but it can be enough to just start other people talking about it, or to give people a bit of confidence that if they put their hand up and say, could we do a bit more about this? That somebody won't just laugh at them and there's somebody else out there. So that might be a really great first step. Chaz, you should put your hand up, become the cycling mayor for Kirklees. And I think once somebody starts some conversations, it can grow some momentum. But I'm not going to lie, grassroots stuff is really hard. I'm involved in stuff in Edinburgh, and it takes a long time. And you have the same conversations over and over again with the same councillors who refuse to accept that anybody has a different experience to theirs. But it's worth a go. So that's one suggestion. Let's get a cycling mayor would be a good start.
Another suggestion, which following on from that conversations and growing momentum, is to really encourage parents, carers, young people to contact their local councillors, writing letters, making lots of noise, that kind of like soft agitation. It really does get people looking. And there's lots of ward councillors who have local budgets as well. So if Kirklees Council doesn't have a big pot of money to do capital investment, there could be some small measures that can really make a difference. Improving signage, repainting lines. I know there's a ward councillor in Stockport who's funded a school street. So there are ways that locally, if you apply that kind of pressure and agitation as well, it can start that snowball. I mean, as it said, like, grassroots is very difficult, and I think that ultimately having capital investment and having strong leadership which is committed to improving place, health, well-being and the lives of people in their area is really the way to get leverage on this.
Yeah, I think there's I think in my experience, local advocacy, that there are so many funding streams, aren't there? It's not just the big capital projects. There's lots of little bits of money floating about, and it's knowing, where they are, what they are, and what they can be used for. Just as to start something off, really. I think we might have time for one more question from somebody called Graham Sheriff. So in terms of cycling infrastructure, do we think there's anything particularly we should think about with a view to encouraging children and families to cycle? Because we've been looking at, before you kind of hit me with all your ideas, we've been looking at the needs of older and disabled people in Wigan, and kind of what their unique needs would be. So do you think that children and families need something different from the traditional segregated routes?
Designing for like really young people, or the older people, or someone that considers themselves disabled or needs to use the mobility aid is the best way to then capture everyone else in between will be able to use that infrastructure. We know that there are some issues with segregated cycleway in terms of maybe if someone's got an adaptive bike or like a carry-on cargo bike for their children, that they could be a bit narrow at times. So I think it's all about the conversation, really. There's the TFGM are putting out the Streets for All design guide, which I think helps to acknowledge best ways that local authorities can plan these types of things, which I think is to be used along with the LTM 120 kind of design guidance. I think it's all about having a conversation and understanding the local needs. And I think it's all also about, I think there's a really important piece that we could look into about working with highways and those that are designing these schemes to get them to understand what it's like to be with a double buggy or to be pushing someone in a wheelchair, because sometimes, like I said before, like just having a drop curb is actually what you need sometimes, or having tactile pavement and improved crossing spaces can really help. So yeah, I guess I think that encompassing the young and the old will capture everyone in between, really. I'm not sure if anyone else has got any other thoughts.
Yeah, can I come in? So I think one of the things that's really interesting, and you mentioned it in your presentation earlier, Liz, was about designing for 12-year-olds, and this is quite a common sort of technical standard that Sustrans and others sort of use. But if we want to be inclusive, we need to think about young children, and they have very different needs to older children who can cycle independently. So young children, so you might have very young babies who are on a bike, obviously on a bike seat or in a cargo bike. So we need infrastructure that allows for their parents to bring them safely. So comfort is important. So cobbles and tactiles are really bad for babies, like bouncing along in these cargo bikes. So nice, smooth surfaces. But width is important. And I think the other thing to think about is that width, because when you cycle with young children, if they're on a balance bike or a scooter or something like that, you often want to be next to them, not behind them or in front of them, but next to them. So you can be talking to them about what they're doing and guiding them. So width of cycleways is really important. And I think that point links back to that double buggy, pushchair, wheelchair thing, that width is important. So designing to make sure that we accommodate all types of cycle, adapted bike, cargo bike, a long base, recumbent, whatever it is. So yeah, new guidance is really important in that, making those standards work for those types of bikes, and to facilitate journeys by families together, because that's important with young children, but then also to enable young kids to negotiate, or children to negotiate safely the infrastructure. So being able to read it and know where you have to go. And I think one of the things about some of the new infrastructure that's going in, it's great to see it going in, but some of the junctions look really complicated. And some of these junctions where there's like a counterintuitive, in order to go right, to turn right, you have to follow a cycleway to the left and wiggle around. And I think that's something we need to think about in relation to children, is that being able to interpret the infrastructure and navigate it safely. I'm not sure that all of those design parameters are quite right at the moment. We've got a bit of work to do, but I think cycling in groups is important, and that's, we see that in Dutch and Danish context, that young people cycle a lot and they cycle with their friends, and you see them cycling along the street having a chat. So there's three young people on bikes talking as they cycle along. So we need infrastructure that will allow that to happen. So I think, again, there are some questions about, are we doing that? I'm not sure we are.
No, and I think that's probably a challenge for some of our Victorian, medieval, urban areas where there isn't a lot of space.
Come now, Ian. Come now. They did have cities and streets in medieval Denmark and the Netherlands. We're not the only place that has old streets.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for correcting me, as always, Caroline. We have got a couple more questions, so try and get through them. And we are overrunning a little bit, but we'll try and get through these. Is there any feasible way to legislate mandatory cycle training for children, or should we? I guess.
So, should I start?
You feel free, Laura.
So what we're trying to trial in now is to address all the children that cannot cycle they didn't learn to cycle, and set up a learn to cycle session in school there was a trial before the end of the last school years, and there was quite a response from parents. It was really interesting to see that basically the situation was that either the parents didn't cycle or didn't feel confident to, and therefore the child that wasn't cycling, but it was willing for the child to start cycling. So we are trying now to work with the head teacher to really address all the children in year 4 and year 3 that cannot cycle, and teach them how to cycle.
And is that through the school? The school's arranging that.
So yeah, I mean, it's in collaboration with the company that runs Bikeability. And what I've noticed is that the children who are attending Bikeability are those that are from family who are already into cycling. It's like raining on a wetland, I would say in Italian. And so I said we should maybe find the children that cannot cycle and therefore they're not doing Bikeability in year 5. And they agreed. And so they said, yes, it's a great value of Bikeability for the children who can already cycle, but I will really tackling those who are more in need.
Yeah.
So yes, this is the future plan now.
Yeah.
Which again, that brings to a cascade of events, because then the children are starting nagging the parents, say, and I want to cycle to school. And and the parents needs to brush up their bikes. Yeah.
Often works. Does anybody want to add to that before we move on? Or
I don't think we should make it mandatory, but I think if we're serious about cycling and training and things, you could add it to the driving test. Make that a requirement of the driving test. That's a young people thing, and I think we think often about young children learning to ride, but it's really important that as people learn to drive, they're also reminded about the vulnerability of pedestrians and cyclists. And it has been long suggested that there should be some integral part of the driving test which is about cycling.
Yeah, that would be my view as well. Although I guess there's an argument that maybe we should be capturing them earlier. But yeah, for certainly anyone that didn't learn to cycle when they were children, I think that's worthwhile, isn't it? Just to make them aware of the vulnerability of cyclists.
There's some great professional training for HGV and bus drivers about cycling, which is it's sort of like one of those CPD things that they can do, and it's really powerful. I've seen lots of presentations about those trainers and the difference in attitude before and after doing that training, when they are forced to cycle around the city and see what it's actually like to be in a junction with things going, on either side of you as a cyclist, and they change their viewpoint as a result.
Oh, that is interesting. Is that in Scotland, Caroline?
It's a national thing.
Oh, is
Sorry
it?
to jump in.
That's right.
Yeah,
it's national.
Yeah, it's national. It's Clocks and Fours accredited. But yeah, if anyone lives or works in Greater Manchester, we do a subsidised course. So all an individual has to pay is the cost of uploading the CPD qualification to their own CPD file, and they can undertake the course otherwise essentially for free. So TFGM are running that with money from the Safer Roads Partnership. So yeah, if you know anyone who drives HGV or works within that area, again, get in touch. We've got these spaces and we want lots of people to go on them. Like Caroline said, it's a really good course for making awareness of vulnerable road users.
Yeah, that's really positive. Okay, shall we finish? We've got one more then. And this is from, if we just take this one off, bear with me. Yeah, Sarah's emailed in and said, what's the best argument we can make to councils and other bodies that active travel, I'm guessing she means generally, is worth investing in, or school travel? Let's say school travel.
I think the best argument is to get the young people and get them to say what they want. Because if I stand up on a stage and give a presentation, it's like, yeah, that's great. If a group of kids stand up, or young people, you know, these can still be like, you know, 17, 16, 18-year-olds, it has so much more impact, and people just seem to resonate with it a lot more. So that's what I would be saying. It's not, sorry, Sarah, it's not a particular argument, but I think it's young people voice is what I think.
Yeah, there's multiple arguments you can make, but I think one of them is, for me, is about independence and empowerment. That active travel and enabling children to travel safely and independently to school at primary and secondary level is an important thing that we give to our kids, independence and autonomy. And I don't think there's anyone that kind of thinks that's difficult or problematic. You know, whatever your views on climate change or whatever, I think the idea that we should enable our children to be independent and autonomous is a really good thing to do. It's good for them, it's good for parents, it's good for society generally to have those young people being able to move around freely, safely, independently in their neighbourhoods. Great thing to do.
Yeah. Asa, Laura?
I don't have any. I mean, I think those are two really wonderful suggestions that I would agree with, and I think it's better than mine. But one thing I was going to say is that there are lots of kind of interrelated benefits that come from these sorts of things around public health or you know, environmental impacts and such like. And the message can be tailored to your audience, I think is maybe in terms of, that's what's maybe something that kind of comes out of the interrelatedness of the benefits of these sort of things.
Yeah, I completely agree. It just ticks all the boxes. So
yeah, I think I would pitch it at the health level. You know, such a strain on local budgets that if you have a healthier population, it's going to put less strain on your budget. Appeal to their base finances. Well, I mean, that's great. I mean, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have to wrap it up there because, well, we've overrun actually. But yeah, thank you very much. Just a reminder to anyone watching that our next seminar on the 24th of October is to launch our report with Transport for Greater Manchester on the mobility and sociability of older and disabled people living in Leigh. So yeah, that'll be a hybrid event. We have got some tickets in person, but online as well. So please join us for that. But thank you to our panelists. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.